Let's talk for a moment about the difference between the hemoglobin oxygen and myoglobin oxygen binding curves as it affects the function. That is, when we go out, and this weekend I'm going to go out for a long run with the ski team, and I want to know for sure that my hemoglobin is functionally picking up oxygen at the lungs and then doing a great job of taking it through my bloodstream and delivering it to myoglobin and my peripheral tissues so that my peripheral tissues can keep on aerobically respiring and functioning well for me while I'm running. So if we think back to the notion that the hemoglobin oxygen binding curve has this lovely sigmoidal form, and this sigmoidal form represents the cooperativity of the hemoglobin oxygen binding, or said another way, if we look at this curve, we can see that at first the hemoglobin molecule will resist the binding of oxygen. But once oxygen binds to one of the subunits of the tetramer, we can see that this leads to an increased likelihood to bind oxygen. Now, this is very different from our myoglobin oxygen binding curve, and that functional difference is really, really important. So we'll recognize the hyperbolic, the rectangular hyperbolic, and I'll do my best here. Great. So we see that very big difference in the two curves. So now if we start to think about what's occurring at my lungs when I breathe in, we know that the hemoglobin will become highly saturated with oxygen at the level of the lungs. Now, even if we're in Laramie, right? Even when we're planning to be up on the top of Medicine Bow this weekend. So even so, my hemoglobin is going to become largely saturated at the level of the lungs. But when it takes when the hemoglobin then takes the oxygen through the bloodstream and to the level of the tissues, that's where we're going to start to see decreases in the partial pressure to the point where we're down around 40 millimeters of mercury or torr. So we're now starting to think about these regions here at the level of the tissue, where what we can see is that the difference between the fractional saturation of hemoglobin and that of myoglobin is very, very different. So said another way, when my blood gets to my tissues, the offloading of oxygen from hemoglobin to myoglobin is going to be favored. There's a very big difference here in the desire of oxygen, or desire for oxygen, of these two proteins. So at the level of the tissues, this maximizes the delivery of oxygen from hemoglobin to myoglobin. So what we could say then is that the sigmoidal binding curve of hemoglobin is absolutely essential to enabling adequate delivery of oxygen to the tissues. And so we want to look at the biochemistry of what is it really that's enabling this cooperativity, what structurally is occurring within the hemoglobin subunits and their interactions that's enabling this cooperative binding curve. So let's take a look now. I'm going to go back to our Chimera files, and I've done some manipulating that I want to show you to see, so that we can see what's allowing for this cooperative binding. So what I've done here is I've zoomed in on two of our different Chimera files. So remember, we had one that was the oxymyoglobin, and that one is over on the right. And then what I did was I deleted all of the subunits except for one of the beta subunits within the deoxyhemoglobin, so that we could get a sense of the difference in the protoporphyrin IX ring when oxygen is bound versus when oxygen is not bound. So on the right, what we're seeing is when that fifth coordination position of the iron is filled by oxygen, and you can see there the oxygen is bound. And I want you to notice what that does to the orientation of the iron ion within the central position of the protoporphyrin ring. Recognize that it moves, and with that movement, it comes into the plane of the ring. So where the in the deoxy form, we see the iron that it's shifted outside of the plane of the ring, but when the oxygen binds, it pulls it into the plane of the ring. And that's because the electronic state of the iron ion, or the iron ion, changes with the binding to that fifth coordination position. More explicitly, the length of the bonds between the iron and the nitrogens of the protoporphyrin ring, they get shorter. And so that allows it to come into the plane of the ring. So whereas here it's deoxy, it's outside and then shifts it in. Now, with that, of course, what does that mean? Well, it means the proximal histidine right here and right here is also pulled. It's pulled, and that means that there's a pulling on the alpha helix that it is a part of. So there's literally a tilt in the alpha helix upon oxygen binding. Whoa, so we're actually seeing a conformational shift within the alpha helix to which that proximal histidine is bound. Now, we know that that's going to be like a domino effect throughout the entire rest of the hemoglobin molecule, and it's going to cause changes at the interfaces between the alpha and the beta subunits. Now, in order to show what those specific changes are, I've actually gone back to our full chimera file with all 4 subunits of the hemoglobin, and I want to draw your attention to what's happening within these subunits. A little bit different change in orientation here, but here you can see the iron at the central position of the protoporphyrin ring, and you can see that it is bound to that proximal histidine. It's not bound to oxygen. So when that oxygen does bind at that fifth coordination position, we know that that's going to bring the iron into the plane of the ring, and that's going to shift this helix right here. And with the shifting of that helix, it's going to change interfaces. Explicitly, one place that will change is right here at histidine. This histidine right here, 97. Notice that in the deoxy form, histidine 97 interacts with threonine 41. Now, when that shifting at the ring occurs with the binding of oxygen, that interaction is disrupted, and instead we see an alternate interaction with threonine 41. So, of course, that's an ion dipole interaction. That will then take the hemoglobin from being in one conformational form, the conformational form in which we see the interaction of threonine 41 and histidine 97 has a name. It's called the T form of hemoglobin. Whereas when we shift and the oxygen is bound and the interaction comes between threonine 38 and the histidine 97, it's moved into a second form, the R form. So this is actually literally called the T to R equilibrium. And I actually am going to go ahead and jot that down for you. So when hemoglobin is deoxy, it is in this T form. T actually literally stands for tense. Now, this makes sense when we think back to the hemoglobin oxygen binding curve. The tense form is the form that resists the binding to oxygen. And so prior to any oxygen's binding, like the molecule that we have here, it's in this tense form that resists oxygen binding. But when oxygen binds, the ion pulls into the plane of the ring. Histidine, the proximal histidine is moved, the helix shifts, and we get the interaction changing between the histidine and the threonines. And then we see this movement. It moves into the R form. So the R, you guessed it, stands for relaxed. And the relaxed form of hemoglobin is likely, very likely, to want to bind oxygen. And we see that in our curve. So the relaxed form doesn't resist the binding of oxygen. And so just to further exemplify some of the changes that occur when the change occurs between the binding of the histidine to the new threonine, there's also other shifts. And one of those shifts is in this histidine here, which is 146, and it actually will form salt bridges with the other alpha subunit. And so we will see those breaking as well. So another element of the T form is that there's these ridges, salt bridges, that hold it in that very tense form, and those will break. And so we see this just overarching movement to relax. Now, there's been a ton of debate in the method that this occurs. That is, people have for a long time debated when one oxygen binds to one subunit of hemoglobin, and we see all of these shifts at the interfaces, does that just immediately cause every single one of the other three subunits to go from being in the tensed form to being in the relaxed form? Or instead, does first one subunit move to the relaxed, and then another oxygen binds, and then another subunit moves to the relaxed, and then another oxygen binds? So the question is this a concerted model, meaning that all of them change at once? Once one oxygen binds, boom, it's like dominoes, all three of these change to the relaxed form, more likely to bind oxygen? Or is it that sequential, like one, then the other, then the other? Well, at this point, most evidence seems to point to the concerted model. However, there are certainly still studies being done, and still those who maybe are looking towards supportive evidence of the sequential model. But that being said, there's a great analogy that I like to make. Once an oxygen binds to the hemoglobin molecule, it means that more oxygens are likely to bind, right? Oxygen binding becomes favored, or the R form favors oxygen binding. I like to say it's kind of like some of us, once we've had one glass of wine, we tend to want to have another glass of wine. So once maybe we're tense and we're like, no glass of wine, and then we have a glass of wine and we're like, oh, I'll have another glass of wine. So that's the T to the R transition, right? Same thing for hemoglobin. It's in this very rigid, very tense form, and then one oxygen binds and boom, the others are more likely to bind. And of course, now we can better understand that within the framework of the sigmoidal hemoglobin oxygen binding curve, and very much recognize this as being a product of the cooperativity, the fact that once one subunit binds to the oxygen, then the others become likely to bind to oxygen. So the sigmoidal binding curve is a function of that cooperativity. It represents the T to R transition, right? If we were just in the T form, it would continue to resist the binding of oxygen. But once it shifts to that R form, boy, it starts to want to bind oxygen.